Quebec is a unique place. It's a vast, densely populated French-speaking province within a much larger, predominantly English-speaking country. The people of the province are amongst the first Europeans to arrive in North America. It's a province which voted not once, but twice on whether it should leave Canada, and both times it narrowly failed. With their national holiday coming up in a few days, let's talk about Quebec. Hi, I'm Tristan. This is Step Back. Subscribe, hit the bell notification to get history every week. This region, which would become Quebec, has been lived upon in some form or another for well over 12,000 years. Its vast territory occupied by a large variety of societies from several diverse nations banded together in the Haudenosaunee, called by the French the Iroquois Confederacy in the south, to Inuit people living in Quebec's frozen north. At least 10 indigenous nations that we know about lived in this region. What we know about this period comes from a mix of archaeological evidence and the oral traditions passed down through the nations that lived here. The first people to arrive in Quebec came around the year 11,000 BCE. The people who entered are still quite a mystery. Only a few pieces of archaeological evidence shows that they existed at all. They were Paleolithic people, direct ancestors of some of the first souls to cross the Bering Strait land bridge from Siberia, give or take a few centuries. The Quebec they called home would be alien to us today. This was still the age of mammoths, giant sloths, and all that. Quebec, however, was still mostly covered in glaciers in this period. It was not until they began to retreat about 10,000 years ago that the population would increase in a meaningful way. With the retreating of the glaciers, the climate of Quebec began to become a bit more hospitable. We see this connected to a population increase in the region. The Iroquois and Algonquin-speaking peoples began to show up in the province in this era. We find specialized tools such as fishing hooks from this period. It wasn't for many thousands of years, though, before farming came to Quebec. The first farms seeming to show up around 1300 years ago, with significant crops made of beans, corns, marrow, and sunflowers. Sometime in the 12th century, legendary figures Hiawatha and Deganawida, along with a partially unknown figure named Jigon Sase, formed an alliance between 5 tribes: the Mohawk, Onondaga, Oneida, Cayuga, and Seneca. The first story of the founding of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy will be sidelined for this video because it's a bit more of an upstate New York story, but also because I think it should be its own video. Comments if you want that. Now, let's talk about the first Europeans to arrive in Quebec. Sometime shortly after the first voyage of Christopher Columbus down in the Caribbean, a French sailor brought back several captured indigenous people, indicating that there was land in the northern Atlantic. A French explorer named Jacques Cartier took up this interest. Trust me, this is important. There's 1,000 streets and buildings named after him in Quebec. On June 24th of 1534, he and his crew landed in the modern-day Gaspé Peninsula, and in a very European fashion, claimed the entirety of other people's territory as the property of the King of France. The next year, he sailed to locations such as modern-day Quebec City and Montreal, meeting the St. Lawrence Iroquoian people living there. Over the next 6 years, the French government didn't do much, not seeing colonization of the region as a top priority. For a few years, it was just a place where fishermen would go for cod and whale oil. They would trade their metal goods with the indigenous people of the St. Lawrence for fancy furs, which would renew interest in the region. Smelling profit, King Francois gave a French noble named, oh boy, Jean-François de la Roque de la Roberval the task of setting up a colony in these lands he called New France. He failed at the job, and it wouldn't be until the year 1608 Quebec City would be founded by Samuel de Champlain, another person many things are named after in Quebec. It was the first attempt to make a permanent settlement. Now, this was not your typical colonization story at first. The juice of this colony would be the trade of furs, especially beaver furs, which were becoming all the rage back in Europe. Some of the most common people to operate here were freelance traders and hunters called les coureurs des bois. There wasn't much official exploration, but many of these freelancers did it themselves. That being said, its remote location and lack of local knowledge made the first few years pretty deadly. A lot of the most valuable land taken by the crown was passed on down to the Catholic Church. While many English people crossed the Atlantic to get away from feudalism, in New France, the church more or less transplanted it. It was a system of people working their land under something called the seigneurial system. Because of this, for a lot of Quebecois history, the Catholic Church would be extremely powerful. The colony had some difficulties keeping active. A war in England blocked supplies down the St. Lawrence River, and they even lost the territory to the English for a few years before peace could be restored. By the end of the 1600s, there were under 20,000 French settlers all the way from the Mississippi to Newfoundland. A little over half of them were farmers. Many came only for a few seasons to fish and trade furs and then go back to France. Women rarely crossed, and those who did were mostly nuns. It got so bad, the king had to incentivize and pay for about 800 young French women to go over, with hopes they'd get married and convince people to stay in New France. There are a lot of legends about these girls, and claiming lineage to these filles du roi, or the king's daughters, is a small part of having real French-Canadian cred. Still, New France existed as a backwater place only good for sending resources back to France. The story was very different down south. By the mid-1700s, the British had grown their North American colonies into pretty much its own country. New France had 10 times the size of those 13 colonies, but only about 1/10 of the population. This was a situation when France and England went to war in 1754. This global conflict, called the 7 Years' War, or French and Indian War to the Americans, would feature several significant battles in Quebec. With control of the Atlantic, the British were able to overpower the French in North America. It came to a head with a massive siege of Quebec City. The troops met in a climactic clash known as the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. Both the leader of the French, Louis-Joseph de Montcalm, and the British general James Wolfe died in the battle. The British then proceeded to occupy New France, and the people living there would never be part of the French Empire again. The war ended with the Treaty of Paris, which ceded all of Canada to the British, and King George III set out to put a government there. This is a significant event in Quebecois history, especially to Quebec nationalists. To them, the Plains of Abraham was when they lost everything, and their oppression by the English began. The Plains are now a park. There's music festivals there and stuff. Seriously, go to Quebec City if you haven't. It's gorgeous. The British would rule over Quebec for the next century. The Quebecois didn't seem to mind a whole lot as long as they were allowed to speak French and practice Catholicism. They also, to this day, were allowed to keep the French legal system. It was the first time any territory other than Quebec City got the name Quebec. All of this formalized in a document in 1774 called the Quebec Act. Another reason the Quebecois got so many concessions is because trouble was brewing down south. In 1775, the American Revolutionary War began, and Quebec was in the crosshairs of the American military. Their goal was to, quote, liberate the French from British rule. During the campaign in Quebec, they even managed to get a few regiments of Quebecois troops to fight for them. The Americans conquered Montreal, but were defeated at Quebec City and forced to retreat. Don't worry, they would try again in the War of 1812. After the war, Quebec and the rest of Canada became a landing place for many Loyalist refugees. Most of them were settled where I am now in what would become Southern Ontario. Since they were a sizable English colony in a French-speaking province, they successfully broke off into what would eventually become Ontario, but in this period called them Lower and Upper Canada. This also oddly resulted in the only elected body in the colonial government in Lower Canada, which would later become Quebec. Within it, a nationalist liberal political party called the Parti Canadien led rebellions in 1837 and 1838. The uprising was driven by an extreme group of them known as the Parti Patriote. They didn't succeed in much but the imposition of martial law in 1840. It resulted in a lot of reforms and tighter control by the English colonial administration. This was also a period when many new immigrants from the British Isles began to arrive in Quebec, creating a sizable Anglophone minority that exists to this day. To further curb the power of the French Canadians, the High Commissioner of Canada, Lord Durham, united Upper and Lower Canada with a single governing body in Montreal, which then was moved to Toronto after a mob set the seat of government on fire in 1849. Then we get to the big year, 1867. After some negotiation, the colonial provinces of New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Canada joined into a new country called the Dominion of Canada. This was when Quebec finally got the name of Quebec. Canada was now a country. Kinda. It took care of its own affairs, but foreign policy was still under the control of the United Kingdom. Quebec, the Canadian province, was dominated mainly by the church. Most hospitals, charities, and French-language schools were run by it. The Quebecois people protested when they detected anti-French oppression in the execution of Louis Riel in the famous Métis Rebellion in Saskatchewan. A future video, I'm sure. Quebec politics often was about trying to gain autonomy for the French population and curb the centralization of Canada. There were a lot of victories, as Canada is a remarkably decentralized country today. Canada's first French-Canadian Prime Minister was Wilfrid Laurier, elected in 1896. He fought the influence of the church in Quebec and dealt with French opposition to Canada's participation in the Boer War. This would be even stronger when Quebec rioted against conscription during the First World War. Hey folks, I just want to duck in for a second to let you know that Step Back grows through word of mouth. So if there's a friend, family member, teacher, or internet community you know might like a Step Back video, be sure to show them. Canada and Quebec also took a hard hit from the Great Depression. Quebec saw a massive move to reactionary politics. Quebecois people doubled down on their loyalty to the church, and Quebec nationalism became a traditionalist movement trying to keep the old ways against a changing world. The people of Quebec elected a man named Maurice Duplessis for 15 years, who deepened church and state relations and fought with unions and intellectuals. Because of his doubling down on traditionalist values, Quebec was insular, abortion was illegal, and divorce would be outlawed until 1968. However, baby boomer Quebecois would fight this. During the 1960s, Quebec went through something called the Quiet Revolution. During this period of reform, Quebec secularized, liberalized, and tied these changes to a new Quebec identity. The province signed an international agreement with Paris, and the Quebecois people protested a visit from the Queen. And of course, with a spike in nationalism, we get a spike in violence. In 1963, the Front de Libération du Québec, or the FLQ, set off bombs in Montreal. This escalated until 1970 when the FLQ kidnapped a cabinet minister and a British diplomat, killing the former. Prime Minister Trudeau, not him, his dad, I thought we solved this in the last Quebec video, imposed martial law on Quebec and invoked the War Measures Act. Nationalism, however, was still on the rise. A new Minister of Culture was founded with the goal of preserving French culture. In 1968, the nationalist Parti Québécois was elected and still exists to this day. Support for more nationalism and separatist ideas circulated throughout the late 60s and 70s, resulting in a failed referendum on separation in 1980. In the early 80s, Canada brought home and ratified its own constitution. All 9 provinces, except for Quebec, signed it. Whenever talks of the Canadian Constitution arose, Quebec's status within Canada would become a central issue. In the 80s and early 90s, the Mulroney Progressive Conservative government in Ottawa tried to bring Quebec into the fold with constitutional accords in Meech Lake and Charlottetown, but these quickly broke down. In 1995, there was a second referendum, and it only failed by the slimmest of margins. I have a whole video about this, so if you want more info, go there. Indigenous people today live in small, scattered communities focused primarily on rural areas around the province. Though this isn't always the case. The Mohawk Reserve of Kanawake is pretty much a suburb of Montreal. Like the rest of Canada, the treatment of Indigenous peoples is a horrific national crime, which we should be pointing out at every possible opportunity. For example, let's talk about the Oka crisis. In 1990, the city of Oka decided to expand a golf course over a plot of disputed land which belonged to the Mohawk Nation. This was done without a single environmental study or attempt at historic preservation. Mohawk community members rallied to defend their territory by blockading access to the land. The Quebec police responded with tear gas and concussion grenades. A firefight broke out, and the Mohawk people managed to drive back the police. The RCMP, our federal police, were called in and also overwhelmed. They even called in the military to make sure that golf course on Indigenous sovereign land could be built. A peace deal was eventually kinda reached. The golf course was canceled and the land purchased by the federal government. This Oka crisis made news around the country, and in a brief, and in this country way too few and far between moment, we saw a little bit of the horrible conditions and violations we inflict on our Indigenous communities. Hey Justin, how you liking that oil pipeline? In more recent times, Quebec has lost a lot of its support for separation. The federal government passed a motion declaring the Quebecois the status of a nation within Canada. The Liberal government in Quebec tried to raise tuition on universities, which resulted in massive protests under something called the Red Square movement. I remember this well because I was in student government in Quebec at the time. It led to the separatist Parti Québécois getting elected, with the province's first female premier, Pauline Marois. I gotta put my cards on the table, I wasn't a fan. What with the trying to choke my small English university out of existence through austerity, and blatantly racist Islamophobic laws, but whatever. Her government only lasted a couple years anyway. And so yeah, we come to today. Quebec is having issues dealing with a rise in far-right groups, especially those of the neo-Nazi and Islamophobic variety. A white supremacist committed a mass shooting of a mosque in 2017, and Quebec goes to the polls this year with an expected wave of right-wing support. But yeah, for all it is, Quebec is a fantastic part of Canada. Its unique culture and place in the country is core to what Canada is, and so I wanted to tell their story. If there's another province I should do, just ask in the comments. I want to thank 12 Tone for the theme song, as well as patrons Don and Carrie Johnson, Colby Monty, Scott Smith, Martin King, and Michael Kirshner. Revenez la semaine prochaine pour plus de Step Back.